Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here for this interesting panel on AI in the urban landscape, navigating data governance with multi-stakeholders. The topic of today covers basically all the topics that you have already seen in different other panels before today and yesterday, since it pulls together the topic of AI, of data governance, of new technologies, and the problem of ensuring individual rights and data privacy. The discussion will offer to the audience will focus on all these elements thanks to the contribution of extremely reputed panelists that I will briefly introduce. First of all, I introduce myself as the moderator of this panel. My name is Carlo Rossi Chauvenet, and I work as a legal data officer at Data Valley, and I teach data protection. Data Valley is a think tank and consultancy company dedicated to data sharing and data governance, and I kindly ask the director to share a slide, the first slide on this. That is not. Thank you. No, it's not this one. It's 0. Anyway, was the number 0, not number 1. Just to cover one of the elements that we'll see in the discussion, so not just describing the theoretical framework of data governance and data protection in the smart city domain, but also to give you some examples. Probably in the last part of this panel, we show you also, yes, this QR code where we focused on, it's a published recent paper dedicated to some use cases in the smart city domain related to data sharing, which is the main topic of this panel. But as I said, let's go first to introduce the panelists. From my right, Sophie Mezzaros, project manager and research advisor of OASC. Barbara De Rosa Lazzarotto, who is PhD researcher in law, science, and technology at the Free University Brussels and MCA fellow. Daniele Panfilo from Aindo is the CEO and co-founder of a startup in the field of synthetic data. And Christopher Wilson is the executive director of My Data Global, which is a major institution and company dedicated to data governance and data protection in the field of smart cities. So I would like to start this panel asking to Sophie Mezzaros to briefly give to the audience an overview of what are the initiatives at the European level that are aimed at helping urban centers develop new data-driven solutions for smart cities. We know that the European Union has devoted a lot of efforts in defining a digital strategy to create data spaces for the smooth and secure sharing of information, and many urban centers are moving in these directions. But one important thing is how to organize all this and to present and offer solutions. So, Sophie, to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So indeed, welcome everybody. Indeed, my name is Sophie Mezzaros and I work at Open and Agile Smart Cities and Communities, in short, OASC. Okay, it works. We are a community-driven organization. We currently have more than 150 communities, so cities and different regions in our network. These communities form a network on a national level. And the idea is that we are here to help communities in their digital transformation. So it means that the idea is that if city A has a problem, then probably city B has a similar problem. And instead of starting from scratch, maybe we could act as a channel or a platform to help adapt the solution of city A in city B. So essentially what we are doing here is to upscale solutions. And at the core of this effort is the concept of interoperability, so the ability to exchange information between solutions quite swiftly. And this is how the community came up with the minimal interoperability mechanisms. These are called the MIMs. It's actually a quite straightforward idea. Sorry, the animation doesn't work, but it's fine, you can still understand it. The idea is that if we lived in an ideal world, then everyone would be using the same systems, solutions, services, but we live in reality, and Europe is especially a diverse place, so we don't use the same systems, and as such, we register, collect data, and exchange information in our own unique ways. But how about in this diversity, we would define a minimal but sufficient level of interoperability? Then we could easily exchange information in upscale solutions. So together with the community, we have now defined 10 areas or 10 themes where we think that interoperability is quite important. This can be loosely categorized in these 3 overarching categories, so interaction, integrity, and impact. And this is actually what the famous meme looks like. So you can see that it has both technical and non-technical elements. The upper part is more non-technical, so you describe what the technology, what are the requirements and the capabilities a technology is supposed to have in order to enable that minimal level of interoperability. And then the meme itself will also suggest mechanisms that are compliant with these capabilities and requirements. And why is this actually good? Because by having these minimal level of interoperability established, so we have common standards and technical specifications used across Europe, then we lower the entry barrier for everyone, and as such we can actually create a common marketplace. And this is really open to everyone, and this is especially important in communities, because in communities we have everyone who is a stakeholder. We have private and public entities, and we have the citizens, we have policymakers, and so on and so forth. So as such, we can say that we are working towards a common marketplace. And while we've been working towards this, Europe has also been working towards this. So this is where we meet with the European strategy for data, especially I'm sure you have heard about the data spaces that are there to enable this common marketplace, or in Europe we call it the European single market. And to understand it a little bit, the idea is not just, boom, there's going to be a single market because we said so. There's a strategy behind it. So we have to work ourselves up towards this common marketplace by starting with the data layer, making that data actually accessible and available by having data spaces in place, and then having different AI and robotic services there to make use of all this available data. And then, for example, we can talk about digital twins. That's very common in the smart communities environment. And on a European level, so the question that actually you asked, Carlo, is that, okay, how does it actually happen? So we have all this journey, but then how do we realize it? How does Europe help us realize this? And it's through all these projects, which for you are now acronyms and totally random and not accessible. It's very difficult to navigate through all these environments, but now I will try to disintegrate it a little bit and explain how they all fit together. So, especially in the smart communities aspect or area, we talk about the Living in EU movement. So this is an environment where different organizations that work towards digital transformation of communities come together, and they lead different working groups together with communities on legal, financial, monitoring and measuring, and technical, and so on. And it is actually in these working groups where together with the community, they come out with solutions and resources for the community itself. So there is, for example, the Lordimas, which is an environment where communities can go and actually measure their digital maturity. Or this is also where the MIMS Plus, so the minimal interoperability mechanisms, are being developed together with the community that are then used in data spaces that are used in Community, which is again a project for creating AI-driven solutions for the marginalized. So what is behind this idea, all of these projects, is that we have a community to work with, it's all community-driven. It comes from bottom, even though it's a European project, the idea is to be bottom-up. So we go and we work with the community itself. We have this process where we go, we define their needs together. Based on that, we co-create the solution, we validate the solution with them, and then we make the resources available to them. And then we go back to the circle again. So an example of this is the European data space for smart communities. This data space had a preparatory phase where we had a community which now has more than 250 stakeholders. So it's everyone in Europe who is interested in data spaces. And together we had different workshops to actually come up with a blueprint how a data space is actually supposed to look like. This has both technical and non-technical elements, but we also thought about like, okay, how do we actually make use of these resources? So we have capacity building resources there, also a roadmap, so guidance of how to actually use these resources to deploy the data space. And again, there is a community itself, so you can meet like-minded people. Specifically, for example, if you think about like the challenge here and why it's important to work with the community is because it's a multi-stakeholder environment. So we have to cater to the needs of different stakeholders. It's not enough to only do it to the private, but also to the public, also to the research, and ultimately to always bear in mind that it's a citizen that we are serving. So it's very important to make sure that we know why you are in the data space. What is your incentive? What is your goal? What do you want to achieve? Then also the resources. What kind of data do you have? Is the data up to standards? Then finally, okay, who is actually the participant and what is their responsibility? You have to pre-establish these things. And finally, also like how to realize this. So what are the legal frameworks to work with? And what are the rules? What is the business model? And where are we now in that process that we just talked about, that there is the going from establishing the needs to all the way to the resources. So now we have the blueprint ready, but now we have to validate it with the community. So this is why the project is actually calling on communities to deploy data spaces, and they offer up to 1.5 million euros to do so. And there will be 10 to 12 pilot sites. So it's not only speaking, but also doing. And if you want to hear a little bit more about us, so we do have quite a few events. Next, we're going to be in Rotterdam. We have a 2-day event. It's free of charge to attend. And then we are also having the data space launch for the open calls on the 1st of June. And finally, you can also, if you are someone who is developing AI solutions for the marginalized, Community is also launching its 3rd open call, and there are going to be open information sessions for that you can join. So I hope this answers your question very briefly.
Absolutely, and I must say, as Datavalley is a stakeholder participating in this community, that absolutely I can ensure that the activity that you're doing is really, really valuable, and it is so needed. The organization of the data, the governance, the use cases available, and we'll talk about later on this. But first of all, let's give also a legal framework, provide a legal framework to this evolution in the digital space. We all know, and I'm as a lawyer, I used to see from Europe coming out more and more pieces of legislations. Could you, Barbara, give us the context and of all these pieces, and what are the interconnections between these legal enactments.
Hello, so thank you very much for inviting me for this panel. So my name is Barbara Lazarotto. I'm a PhD researcher at VUB. I'm here to talk a little bit about the legislation, the regulations behind what Sophie just said. So I think your work was very important because you translate what I'm going to do to speak a little bit to the citizens, because they are not, they cannot understand. If we still don't understand, how can the citizens understand as well how the legislation works? Okay, so I will start a little bit with the context. So to use AI in smart cities, the base point is the data governance behind it. So because data is going to be the food that feeds the AI, so it can be translated into better services for citizens. So how that works. So the data governance is essential. It's we can be considering it the foundation where the smart city, let's say, will be constructed and all of the services will be constructed. So right now we have the data, the regulation, the package of regulations that Europe has enacted. So they are multiple. We still are figuring out how they interact with each other. So we are still asking questions and still coming with use cases that were not initially thought by the legislation, but it came up. So these multiple regulations are relevant in this context, and they must, or at least should, work in synchrony so we can use them for AI and data in smart cities. So the European data strategy is this multi-regulatory plan. So when it comes to personal data, it builds on top of the GDPR, of course, but we are also talking about a large amount of non-personal data and mixed data sets, so how they interact with each other. Let's see. So first I will start with the Data Governance Act, which was very important to highly connect with what Sophie said because of the data spaces. So the Data Governance Act created these mechanisms for data, for the sharing of and reuse of public sector data specifically. So the private sector can take this data, which is highly non-personal data in general, and apply for other purposes. But also the Data Governance Act enacted the idea of data spaces, so which is very important for us, especially in the smart communities context. So it applies to public sector bodies covering personal and personal data. It can be considered a very important tool, so you share the data that is held by the government to the private sector, which can be used for AI systems to better the lives of citizens, for transportation methods and so on. So this is a very important piece of the puzzle. It is yet to be seen how data altruism, which is another mechanism that was enacted in the Data Governance Act, that is more focused on the private sector to share data with the public sector, how they will match with the rest of the legislation. But it's a very important piece of legislation, especially for the data spaces, which is the core base of your organization. So, but I want to play the devil's advocate here because we were talking about citizens and how the Data Governance Act talks about this, but there's no mechanism for citizens' participation, public participation. So where this comes from, the importance of your network to bring the voice of citizens to the table, because the legislation doesn't talk about this at all. So this is a very important piece of mind that we must talk about. Going a little bit out of the data strategy, but is also very important, is the Open Data Directive. It came before the EU data strategy, but it's a very important core piece of legislation that it can serve also as a backdrop to stimulate the reuse of public sector data. So also says that the public sector must push forward, share more data. It's a problem because many member states do not apply the Open Data Directive. So the Data Governance Act comes and pushes a little bit forward, but it can work as a twin, let's say, from the Data Governance Act. And my really I really like the Data Act because people don't care about the Data Act, but I think it's very relevant. So the Data Act mainly aims to talk about IoT data, but if you look at Chapter 5, they talk about the sharing of data between the private parties to the public parties, which is the first time that Europe has enacted something like that. And I have written a piece of paper about this, about the potential of using this piece of legislation to smart cities. So how the private sector can share more data for the public sector to feed AI systems, for example, for the public good. So this is a very important piece of legislation. So it creates mandatory business-to-business data sharing in situations such as, like, for example, floods and very extreme situations, but also it opens a door for the public sector to ask data from the private sector in certain situations. So I think there's a loophole here that allows the development of smart cities, and I think in matching this with the Data Governance Act, although the Data Act says that the public sector that has this data cannot further share with the other parts of the public sector, I think using the Data Act with the Data Governance Act is a good thing. I think it's a very good piece of legislation that can help with the data, with using AI. I think I must mention the challenges. So we still don't know, this is my PhD basically, so we still don't know how the synergy between the different regulations when it comes to sharing data in smart cities, how we deal with data subject rights when you're talking about sharing data in this, but I think we must take into consideration that data can be a very good thing for cities, and we must take about that. This leads us to the other speakers today and how we can enact this in a positive manner. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, because you briefly gave an overview of such a complex framework in such a very short period of time. We have, of course, a lot of questions on this, and the problem of the intersection between GDPR and the AI Act, of course, is there. Yesterday, probably some of you participated to one of the panel dedicated to the major questions related to the AI Act and the discussion over the possibility to see some new legal basis from the AI Act in order to share, because we need training data. We need to train these algorithms, and it seems like, because it is mentioned in the AI Act, that a new kind of technology appears to be very promising in this anonymization possibility. So the idea of sharing data without putting at risk individual rights. Is it really possible, or is it something that we should talk about? Yes, for sure, we will talk about it. And I give the floor to Daniele Panfilo, the CEO of a startup that has been 5 years working on finding solution for the anonymization problem. I give you the floor to you.
All right. Oops. Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, indeed, it has been already 5 years. It's fun because when I started in my PhD, I have a background in tech, not in any legal, I would say, topic. The idea was leveraging generative model for completely different purpose. Yeah, I'm gonna make you laugh. My idea was to use generative model to give back the voice of Homer Simpson because the Italian dubber was dead, and then I wanted to synthesize the voice of Homer Simpson so that I could watch again Simpson with the original Italian dubber. And I didn't know at the time that I was gonna end in a topic completely different from that, but the idea is basically stemmed out of this university project during my PhD, and to leverage generative model to create synthetic data. So in the upcoming 10 minutes, I'm gonna tell you why we do this and what is synthetic data, because in the past few years, we came from nobody knowing about it to Many people speaking about it, and from a completely absent regulatory landscape from this type of technology to a sort of, I would say, framework at least, that try to regulate this, which at the end is still quite new technology. So very briefly, why we imagine that this technology could be of use for the problem of data sharing, and because at the end of the day, when we start with the company, the initial challenge we want to face was to foster AI adoption. Everybody knows that AI is a really good force, and it's changing, and it will continue doing our life in many different ways. But at the end, there is also this nice way of saying in AI, which is no data, no party. Without data, you don't train AI models. So it's as easy as that. And core obstacle, and if you see at the pace at which data gets collected nowadays, this is very, very high speed. I mean, it's kind of exponential. And you would expect that then innovation coming from this type of data, this huge availability of data, would follow the same pace. And with our huge surprise at the beginning, we realized that this is not true. This is not true, and not because you cannot really train algorithm of this data, because the data are not good enough, or we do not have enough data. But coming from a technical background, we couldn't expect that one of the major concerns was the privacy. Most of the data that nowadays gets used to train AI system are personal data, you know better than me, and therefore they follow under specific regulation. So this matching with my research at the time came to the idea that at the end, when performing data analysis, when using AI, when using data to train AI system, you are not really interested in the granular data, in the punctual data. This is more liability. The real assets when training AI system or conducting statistical analysis is indeed the statistical part of the data, the behavior of the entire population. You do not train a classifier to tell you if you are if it's safe or not giving you a specific amount of credit over a single person. You use behavior and pattern of an entire population to derive and extract information that at the end of the day are general enough in order to make you take informed decision in a proper way. And how these synthetic data are created, I hear that many people now know about this technology, but very few really grasp the idea about the background technology that is in the technology that is in the background of this solution. The idea is very simple, and I'm not going to go into the mathematical detail now. There are 20 pages of formula I will show later, not joking. But the idea is very simple. You analyze the data. You have a real data set with, I don't know, 1,000 patients, if you are in a healthcare, in healthcare, or maybe in smart cities, you have travelers, because this is a very general technology. And what you do, the idea is that you train an AI system over this population of the data. This AI system understands pattern and characteristics, certain trends and correlation among the original data. And what it does, it injects this kind of information, this kind of statistical information, not punctual information, but just statistical information, into a completely fake population. So we create a new population that behaves, statistically speaking, like the original population, but with all new customers, all new patients, all new travelers, and so on. So the question that we get most of the time, is this safe? Is this personal data? Is this private data? Well, we can argue. I think the debate is still ongoing, and I foster and I welcome any type of, I'd say, any type of question. But the point is that when developing a new technology, it's not only the technology itself that has to be investigated, but also in this case, we had also to build the assessment metrics. How do we evaluate this? Is it safe from a privacy point of view? It is useful for all the use cases that we imagine. And which are the use cases that we imagine for this type of technology? Well, the idea is to, instead of sharing personal information and real data, you share artificial data, synthetic data, and what you can do over this. Technically speaking, ideally speaking, you want to achieve a level in which you can answer the same question using synthetic data. The idea is that if I query the synthetic data, I get the same answer I would have gotten querying the real data. If I train AI system over the synthetic data, the system trained over the synthetic data performs as good as the system trained over the real data. And then the question is it private? Synthetic data are private. How do we assure that synthetic data do not contain any personal information? And therefore, given the type of usage that you imagine for synthetic data, another question is does this really maintain all the statistical information of the real data? And then third is if I use synthetic data to train a system, do they really perform as good as those trained over real data? So we developed this kind of framework to assess the privacy. And I mean, of course, when it comes to privacy, it's, you can refer to standard type of attacks that are conducting against standard anonymization techniques and see how they perform over real data. Well, now if you look at a type of attack that's singling out a specific individual from anonymized data, then this makes sense because you think you have a real data, you anonymize this real data, this keep on being a real data, just you remove certain part of information, but the risk of tracing back the synthetic data to original entity is still there because anonymized data is still real data. If I have Mario Rossi and some information about Mario Rossi and I anonymize this, that record's still real data about Mario Rossi. So theoretically, I could go back to the original entity. So also developing attacks against synthetic data that are fake data, it's complicated, but we don't want to protect our technology. We want to attack it and see how this kind of technology perform against this specific attack. So a way, I'll give you an example, to try to attack synthetic data is I take very rare sample in synthetic data. Just one person of Daniele, 35 years old, from Rome. There is just one single record of this type of person in synthetic data. Then I can imagine that this very rare category in synthetic data is going to be also very rare in the real data. So what I look for similar rarity in synthetic data and try to guess. Is this Daniele Mario in the real data? And stuff like that. And then now the question is, how much this is safe? Well, I have to have a benchmark. I have to compare this type of attack against something. And the idea is, if I try a random guess, how better am I with synthetic data than when I try to have this kind of linking attack with, singling out attack with a random guess. So if every time that I find a very rare category in synthetic data, I am able to devise a real rare individual in the original data, then of course synthetic data revealing information. If I'm able to do this 10% of the time compared to the random guess, then this is the increase in risk with synthetic data. Why I'm saying this? I'm, of course, a big fan of synthetic data, but this is not the solution for every problem. This is an enhancement in a direction. This is an enhancement in the direction of privacy, of course. And yet, the framework to assess the level of safety of this type of technology is a topic that is still ongoing at a research level. We keep on publishing in peer-reviewed journal how we can attack it, how we can protect against this. But up to now, it seems a very good increase in terms of privacy, at least. When it comes to fidelity, it's much easier. The second question is very, very straightforward. I just measure certain type of statistics over the synthetic data. I measure the same type of statistics over the real data, and then I measure the distances between them. If they're not too far away, that means that the distribution, the pattern, and the correlation within the synthetic data are maintained together with the real data. So then we measure the distances, and we are able to answer this question. When it comes to utility for AI training, and I'm going to go quick to the use cases after this, is very easy. You have the real data. We take out a sample of this real data, then we train synthetic data over what is left of the real data, and then we have now synthetic data and real data and a left-out set. We train a model of synthetic data, we train an AI model over the real data, and we test the performances over the left-out set. If the performances of this kind of model is the same over a data that has never been seen, neither from the model that is being trained over the real, neither of the model nor on the model trained over the synthetic, then we have an answer. This data is as useful as the original one. Why this is, what have we been doing in order to, what have we been looking at to say that this kind of technique is good? Well, it's not saying that this technique, as I said at the beginning, it's bulletproof from everything, because very easily, a stupid error you could commit is that when generating synthetic data, you generate a real sample, and then I'm leaking out exactly that person. So this is not this is not a bulletproof, but we have been measuring the benefits of this kind of technology against the privacy, and we have found with different studies that the privacy is increased. It's much harder to attack synthetic data than anonymized data. The feature statistics that we have shown is much more maintained better within the synthetic data, as well as the correlation between the characteristics. and of course the utility when ML performance. Why this? Because the synthetic data is a completely different paradigm when compared to anonymization, to all those techniques. This is not starting from the real data, removing information, and then making this real data safe. This is starting from real data and creating completely fake data that mimics the behavior of the original one. So because of the way in which this is produced, at the end of the day, has this kind of increase, not really solution again for everything, but an increase when compared to standard techniques such as randomization, permutation, and so on. But let's go to the case study. Oh, sorry, I was changing on my, but not here. Let's go to the case study. Of course, here we are talking about smart cities, so I can give an example of smart cities application and use cases. But up to now, you should have gotten that this is a very generic technology. You can apply for health, for smart cities, for finance, and so on. But few use cases we've been dealing with the context of smart cities. That imagine that you want to analyze the behavior of the demand, the supply demand of a smart grid. So you want to optimize the energy that you deliver in specific node of a network. Of course, in order to conduct these kind of studies, you'd have to access several type of data shared. Whoa, shared. It looked like a sneeze. It sounds like a sneeze. Shared among different users. And this can be municipality, energy provider, consultant, and so on. What's the problem? That actually sharing this kind of information may be risky because at a granular point of view, knowing that a specific house, for instance, consumes very little energy could be that there is nobody inside, and this could be a risk to sharing this information because then somebody could get in and steal your stuff. So how did we try to solve this? The idea is very easy. Instead of sharing real data, we have synthetic data of this type of consumption, of this kind of population consumption, and instead of sharing the real, we share the synthetic. We train a model to optimize the request and the supply demand of the energy supply, and then we can we can improve these processes without sharing any real information. So the idea is when it comes to use this data to a statistical point of view, synthetic data is a very good, I would say, solution and alternative. Another one, and I'm gonna quick close because Carlos is telling me you're taking too much time. So it's within let's say that you want to optimize now, instead of the energy, the traffic. Let's say that you have a certain type of nodes, also from a geographical point of view, and you want to leverage the floating car data in order to optimize the traffic within a city. This is, again, a problem that you can tackle with synthetic data. Now the data is different. We're not talking about consumption, and this is the important part to grasp, that we are agnostic about the type of data as long as they are in a tabular format. But of course, sharing your position, the position and the signal that you retrieve from your cars to optimize the traffic, I would say it's quite personal. I was working at Allianz a few years ago. It seems like a life, but I was working in this problem. We were analyzing black box signal coming from the cars, and these are very personal information. Even here, the synthetic data can come in handy in order to collect this information, generate a fake population that mimic the behavior of the original one, and use this type of data to optimize the network and the road. So, as I said, very quickly, I am done.
Thank you, Daniele. So a lot on the table in terms of use cases, of possibility, and opportunities. But there is a lot to talk about on this, and I leave the floor to Christopher Wilson from what is My Data doing, My Data Global doing on the user-centric approach, and how you are tackling the problem of involving citizens in the governance of AI.
Thanks so much, and I'm going to resist the urge to just talk about those three presentations, which were all so fascinating. There's so much to say. Shall I click? Is there a button I need to click to start
Last
the
slide.
slides? Yes, voila. Okay, first of all, I'd like to point out that I'm emphasizing here human-centric, and I think that's potentially different than citizen-centric or user-centric. For us, the important thing is people and how individuals and persons relate to and control their data. So the core idea of my data is that people should have control. This gives them power, it gives them protection, and it creates values for individuals in their daily lives, in the way they interact with their data and services. It also creates value for markets, for businesses, and for society. It's important to note that there's lots of data out there. Data is everywhere, and whether or not it's classified as personal data according to GDPR or other frameworks, almost all of this data is or can be or likely will become very deeply personal. It becomes personal in the way that it affects our lives through decisions that are made by others on the basis of data. It can be, non-personal data can become personal when it is aggregated and processed through machine learning. And even non-personal data, which is applied in isolation, can have very personal consequences for the way I live my life and the kinds of services and conveniences that are available to me. And so I'm increasingly finding myself talking about people's data more than personal data. I made slides for 20 minutes, but I only have 10, so I'll move quickly for some of these. First and foremost, my data global is a community. We have local hubs around the world that hold meetings and bring stakeholders together to talk about how to advance this mission. We also have a number of thematic groups that produce white papers, develop frameworks, work on standards, engage externally on specific issues. We have a number of organizational members. And my data is also a technical approach to data intermediation. So in 2020, we came out with a white paper about the My Data Operators, which is a mechanism for personal data intermediation. And the very, very oversimplified idea is that an operator is someone who controls the flow of personal data between third parties with the interests of the individual, of the person, governing how that's done. There's been a lot of work on that. There have been multiple white papers, reference models, specifications. There are frameworks. There's a few sectoral frameworks down here. There's a lot of detail out there. It's all very complicated. And it's becoming more and more complicated as we see infrastructures developing in novel and new ways, European common data spaces, not in the least. We see new governance models emerging, new business models emerging. I don't think anyone really knows for sure how this is going to look 10 years from now, what kinds of systems and technologies are will be governing the way data is shared. But the basic idea is that it should be human-centric. So since 2020, we've been providing awards. Over 30 service providers from 16 countries have been given awards so far for taking a human-centric approach to governing the sharing of personal data. And one thing we've learned is that it's not just about the companies. In order to achieve human-centric ecosystems for data sharing, we need business components, legal, technical, society. All these puzzle pieces have to fit together, which is what's so nice about this panel. We need the whole sandwich. In terms of data governance, we often see this fitting together as a nested tier of 3 different levels. So as Barbara described, we've got the policy and the regulation at the top level, but then beneath that, at the ecosystem level, we've got things like codes of conduct and contracts and administrative rules that dictate the way different parties within an ecosystem interact. In the city context, this can involve businesses, different agencies, et cetera. But at the end of the day, there's also a lot of governance aspects that are hardwired into the tech. And this can be in very, very subtle ways in the UX that dictate how individuals relate to and think about their data in the first place. So now moving on to the meat. What does it mean for cities? So we don't entirely know. This is nascent, but we've got a handful of members and partners who are working on this at the city level, and we're starting to collect some insights. Perhaps the most mature of these is what's being done by Atumi, the Flemish data corporation, Flemish Data Utility Corporation, it was previously called, which is set up in Flanders. I think we've heard some reference to it already. There's some people in the audience who work directly with this. And the general idea here is that every citizen is given or has access to a pod, a personal open data management system. It's a place where all their data from different services can be collected and controlled by them. And the basic idea is that this data vault is something that provides an intermediation platform between third-party services. And so my data can be accessed by companies or B2B or B2C companies when I consent to it. But that's entirely under my control. Now, there's several use cases and sectors that are on the books and being rolled out. So far, there's a lot of data already being shared on skills, things like diplomas, benefits, stuff like that, and on health data, which has the potential to, really interestingly integrate health data from practitioners, from administrative services, but also from wearables and things like that. What's really interesting to my mind about the Atumi work is these four things. First of all, the pods are virtually invisible to the users. If I might have a pod when I sign up for sharing my data, but I get that as a request for a very specific sharing of my data to a very specific service. And this might show up on any number of platforms that I use, whether it's my bank ID or my social security web page and portal. And whether that happens on one platform or another, it's all interoperable in the background, and I don't have to think about whether there is a pod that consolidates all that information. All I have to think about is whether or not I want specific data about me to be shared with specific services to give me a specific benefit. The consent is thus decentralized across different platforms and caters to what people are already using. There have been challenges with third-party service uptake and data access. There remains a culture in many data holder organizations, from what I hear, which are not always eager to share data, even though there's a strong business case for the value that can be generated both for individuals and for companies. So when I heard the folks at Atumi talk about this 2 weeks ago, it was really fascinating to hear about how much of the work for advancing this technology is really about institutional engagement, onboarding, and building up cultures for data sharing. So, the last point I'd like to make in the context of cities is something we haven't heard a lot about yet, but I would really like to ask the question about what digital services and empowering people with control over their data that drives public services, what can that do for the civics of a city or a small government organization? I'm of the opinion that even small things like, getting driver's license digitalized or having digital access to health records, when that constitutes a government interface, that can have some kind of effect on my civic engagement, the way I think about my government. It can potentially strengthen the social contract, and that can have a really positive effect. As cities are increasingly digitally transforming and adopting new technologies that they might not understand, I would like to see this rationale built into the way we think about it to maximize that potential. So we're not only improving services, not only empowering people, but we're strengthening the civic connections. Okay, so what does it mean for AI? Because so far I've largely talked about data. So first of all, AI creates data when it is applied, and when citizens interact with AI-driven services, that creates data, which should be subject to a human-centric approach. It also is based on data, which should be subject to a human-centric approach, and it also creates outcomes, which we have to think of in terms of people first. We often talk about OpenAI, or we often refer to the name OpenAI, but I don't think we often talk about what OpenAI means. And I think we can take a cue from the open data movement and think about open in terms of inputs and outputs. So if we think about the openness of the processes through which cities apply machine learning and AI services, we can think about the way that citizens are aware of the machine learning applications, where the data is taken from. There's the questions of whether or not individuals want to contribute their data to these platforms or not, whether that can be retrieved. I think it's also important to think about federated learning and access to services. The novel thing about the pods is that the information is held by the individuals. So in order for a health insurance company to use that data, they don't need to take it and consolidate it on their server. They get consent from a number of individuals, and then they are able to access that data for federated learning and apply the algorithms without holding the data. And I think this is a model that can be explored. And in a sense, I wonder if that's a model that's in competition somewhat with synthetic data, because both address some of the privacy risks, but it's a very way of doing it. And one of my concerns about the synthetic data might be that it really takes the person out of the loop, whereas we'd really like to see people more and more in control of the services and the data. And then lastly, just the importance of user experience. People relate to government services, city services, and all kinds of services by what they see, whether it's on their phone or their computer and what's presented to them. And I think there's also strong leadership being showed by Atumi on that front. So I'll wrap up now just saying, in short, I think the My Data principles still apply, but when we think about the conditions, what this means for setting up ecosystems for the use of AI in cities. Oh, and this is an old slide version. So I was going to suggest just quickly, and I will read it then. So we need transparent network level governance agreements. When there is an ecosystem for the use of AI in cities, and the data that implies, the network level agreements, the ecosystem level agreements for how that works should be transparent and human readable, but also layperson readable. We need audit logs and ways of tracking where the data comes from and where it's going, so that can be seen by the people for whom it applies to. And we need decentralized identifiers and data model schema, so that identity is bound into this and bound into the control of the data. And that's where potentially, this is something we talked about earlier this morning, maybe even software agents that represent the interests of different parties to data sharing agreements. And as AI consistently comes to the front end of city services, I think that's something worth exploring, once again, to put people in control. There's some more links if you'd like to know more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for this presentation that put the focus on people and technologies, but dedicated to their interests, so their centricity of the users. And also you talked about the importance of use cases, of best practices, and the literacy on this. So I would like to give back the floor to Sophie to ask what kind of use cases have you studied and not only studied, but somehow helped in their evolution, and what is the process that you have designed in order to make this use cases more accessible for other cities that want to become smart?
Thank you. But maybe also just given the time, if anyone has maybe questions, should we also take them?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
If there are. If there are not, then okay. Because we have 10 minutes, right? Okay, because maybe, and then we can move on to the use cases.
Okay. Yeah, very quickly, I have a question for Daniele. What is exactly the difference between synthetic data and anonymized data? Because at least according to the GDPR, data that is no longer linkable to an identified person is anonymized. So are we here talking about a specific, even maybe more reliable anonymization technique, or is it something different?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the difference is the following. Imagine you have real data. And I mean, at the end of the day, the product is anonymous data. So such data is not more personal anymore. You cannot retrieve information about the real entity. The difference is in the paradigm and in the way in which this level is achieved. Towards standard anonymization technique, you have a real data and you manipulate the real data to make this real data anonymous. But imagine a table with 10 records. You start from these 10 records, you apply randomization, generalization over the real records, and then you have an anonymous data where you apply this kind of operations, but where every record is still linkable one-to-one to a real person. That's Mario Rossi. I eliminated few information, I applied randomization techniques, and now I have a new anonymized version of the same data, but where every specific record of this kind of data set is still a real person. In principle, you could go back. This person exists, to tell you in a short way. From standard, when it comes to synthesis, you have the same 10 people, okay? You do not go column by column applying any type of, I would say, operation to anonymize it. You infer the pattern, you understand the statistical correlation between columns and so on, and now you create all new data set with 10 fake people that if analyzed, they respond and they give you the same information of the real one. To give you an example, but they do not exist in the original data sets. So let's say now I ask to the synthetic data, what's the average of age in my data set? The real data would be 37. The synthetic data would be 37.2. So you are able to retrieve the same statistical and pattern information, but now it's impossible to take one record in the synthetic data set and trace back to any originality, because this record does not exist in the unanonymized data set, in the real data sets, in the input data. So that's the differences. At the end of the day, the product is the same. You achieve a level of anonymous data, but with data that are not even real. They are all completely new data sets.
I think there are other, the panelists have priority.
No, I'll stand, but I'd love to follow up on that.
Okay. It was first. Sorry, it was first on the. Okay.
Does it work? Okay. I'm a little bit shocked because anonymized data means that we cannot go back to the individual person. And you just said that you've studied a lot in your PhD, and anonymized data can still be related back to the person in the table. So I was a little bit shocked. That's why I reacted immediately. Still, I don't know if my colleague really had the answer, but I didn't understand anyhow your answer to the question, because I had the same question. In the GDPR world, we are talking about the real data, which identifies or allows to identify a person, pseudonymized data, which allows us to link with other sets of data to come back to the raw data, and anonymized data. From this trilogy of data in GDPR, what is exactly synthetic data? That's the question.
Yeah, we have Barbara.
We were discussing this before our panel, actually. We were like, we can stay here for 3 hours just discussing, because the AI Act talks about synthetic data.
Yes, that's the only paper which talks now, really, I mean, at my knowledge. Of course.
And we were thinking, if this is not on the GDPR, is this a third category of data that is not either personal and non-personal, it's synthetic? What is synthetic? We don't know. We don't have the answer.
I have
My
a guess.
understanding is that legally speaking, you're right. It's the only piece of legislation where synthetic data is mentioned so far. But there are also some works by, for example, JRC, so the Joint Research Center of the European Union, that talks about the EDPS as talked about the role, the importance of synthetic data in the anonymization process. Is another technique to get anonymized data. Okay. So is a technique that can be jointly used with other techniques, like, for example, differential privacy, in order to guarantee better the anonymization of data. So what Daniele, I think he said, is not that anonymized data are data that cannot can be re-identified. It's not what he said. He said anonymized is anonymized. But if you use poor techniques, it might be possible to go back. So they are not really anonymized.
Yeah, but then we arrive in reality to the fact that, let's be honest, maybe we should update GDPR and say anonymized data does not exist.
Actually,
because there is a risk with
there,
the technology development in the future.
Definitely.
This is anyhow a way.
I leave the floor to. No, actually, we had a question before, so I had to guarantee the priority. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I will show you synthetic data later.
Yes. Hi, so my name is Yannick Vogel. I'm with the Dutch DPA. And I have a question for Barbara, but if anybody else is a real Data Act nerd, then you might pick it up as well. So I'm wondering about Chapter 5 of the Data Act, which in essence deals with business to government data sharing. So not the other way around. The question is, in what cases can public sector bodies access privately held data? Which I think is very interesting. And there's essentially like two situations. In the first one, you need to have an emergency situation, pandemic, flood, yada, 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 and an exceptional need to use data. And in that case, you can access personal data held by companies. And in the second one, if you don't have an emergency situation, but you still have an exceptional need, you can request non-personal data. And so what the European Commission says in their fact sheet on the Data Act is, well, if you're a public sector body and you have difficulty optimizing traffic flows, traffic as in cars, and you have an exceptional need, well, then you can use personal data, but you can ask to have it anonymized, so it's non-personal data, so you meet the requirements. And I thought it was an interesting way to interpret the notion of exceptional need. So my question to you is training AI by public sector bodies also an exceptional need, in your opinion? And the second question is, does this construction open the floodgates to a lot of data sharing from privately held data towards government, and is that a bad thing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I never thought about the first part of your question. I think from the perspective of using AI more and more, and because also we have to think about the public interest. They mentioned that it's for the public interest, right? And for the public purposes, which is quite open. And we have, they say that it must be detailed in legislation from the member states. And this can be open a door for multiple purposes. I have the opinion that yes, it can be not AI can be for exceptional purposes, but I think AI can be considered for the public interest depending of the situation, but it must be justified under the legislation of that member state. And I have a paper that I wrote before the Data Act was approved about this, the possibility of interpreting this for using for smart cities, for example, for traffic management. So I was talking with Malte from the European Commission, and he was like, I never thought about this. It's possible. We still don't know if it's going to be used, but I think it's an interpretation that it's quite interesting, and I agree with this. I think so, yeah. Yeah, sure.
Now we didn't have the time to go over the use cases that we prepared, but this is also the concept behind the data spaces as well, to touch upon this exact thing, like how to help this multi-stakeholder environment and enable the data sharing across the private and the public sector. And there was actually this use case which originates from the Netherlands. So it's the IDEA one, where it's called IDEA, where they actually look at the road closures and how to use that kind of information, how to make that information actually useful for traffic optimization. So if you want, I can show that to you later.
For the question.
Yeah, just on the last point, I think the interesting thing is to look in the design of any such data sharing agreement or service development, how can this help people by giving them a say in the process and giving them a control over the process. And if I take off my data hat for a moment and put on my digital security hat, I would say that there's strictly speaking no such thing as anonymized data. That's a naive concept. Whether or not we should review the GDPR is another question. But synthetic data, if we, by the premise that it is not anonymized data, but it's anonymous data, and that it is truly, it accomplishes what it says it will in terms of not being, you can't reverse engineer back to individuals. I don't think that solves all the problems, because if you have a large enough data set, you might still have individual records popping up that mimic with significant overlap real individuals. You might have misperceptions about what it relates and how it relates to specific individuals. And perhaps most importantly, you still have group level representations and inferences. So for the example that you gave on energy consumption, you might be able to see from the synthetic data set that households within 10 kilometers of point A that have a medium house value below so many euros have these kinds of patterns that could open up opportunities for predatory lending institutions to target them. Or, there's a variety of things that could be used with synthetic data to target groups. And synthetic data doesn't manage all of that necessarily. Giving people control might not necessarily manage all of that either, but putting my data hat back on, what we lose with synthetic data, which I'd like to pursue, is the opportunity to give that homeowner a chance to control the data so that they can review their own energy consumption, make smarter decisions about their consumption, use that to automate subsidies and relationships with energy providers. There's a whole host of things that you can give to the individual when they're the point of integration. And so I'd argue for exploring that first.
Thank you for this clarification. I think it's a tool. Synthetic data will not solve all the other problems. It's an opportunity. On the other hand, about anonymization, we've seen that the Court of Justice last year opening up to pseudonymization at large as a way of anonymization. So probably the elements that Daniela mentioned on the to review the attacks, so the linkability, the single out, and the inference will be re-evaluated, and actually we know that the DPP is working on a new opinion about the anonymization characteristics and references. So do you want to add anything on this?
Same exactly comment you are going to say about the Court of Justice interpretation of the Court of Justice recent interpretation. It's not a judgment, was the General Advocate mentioned about what is personal data, and he's trying to restrict a little bit. So maybe this has impact what is anonymization, and also what is synthetic data as well. If synthetic data can be considered personal data or not.
So, are there other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. This was super interesting. Mine is actually a small technical question on the synthetic data. So you were saying that the synthetic data virtue is that it remains the statistical properties of the original data set without allowing anyone to single out an individual because it's a completely new data set. My question is whether when you are setting up a synthetic data set, you need to program it. I'm totally at loss with the words, but like you'll get me. You need to program it for certain statistical values, and whether the data set is so construed by a generative AI algorithm that you can also redeploy it for other purposes, because it's so my question is, if I'm using it for traffic management, there's certain variables that I care about in traffic management, and there's certain variables that I don't care. And so I imagine that when I'm creating the new data set, I will say, I care about these statistical values, remember this staying the same, but not in the other ones, because I imagine that if all the statistical values are exactly the same, then essentially I will have the same data set.
Okay.
Or not. And if that's not true, then why? Sort of.
Very good question. And the answer is aptly, no, you don't have to program for specific statistics, because the model infer the general behavior, not specific. Is not the generation is not targeted to the usage of those kind of data. So this means that you can reuse the data. But then I tell you, and coming to the second point, this means that they're exactly the same data. Here the answer is happily no, because you can achieve an average of 35 with many different type of number. You can achieve a level of correlation with different type of numbers. So the idea is exactly that, replicating all the initial global statistical pattern without defining what I want to maintain and what I want to cut. So the general behavior of the population with completely new set of data, not with the same exact data. So it's because you don't have, the real concept is that we maintain the general statistic, the overall statistic with completely new set of data sets. So it's not the same. The statistics are all the same at any level. How you cut, however you cut the data, in any way you cut your data set, you would ideally have the same level of statistical fidelity. Doesn't mean it's exactly the same. Otherwise, to achieve exactly the same, you would have to copy-paste your original data. But we maintain the statistic up to a certain level, generally above 95%. This means that synthetic data cannot be better than real data. So there is also there a loss of information, a loss of of information and a loss of utility, but it's less when compared to other techniques.
Isn't that dependent on the depth of the query? So, for example, it's one thing if you're asking about people 35 to 40 years, but if you're asking about Spanish-speaking women who live in cities between 35 and 40, you'll have a lot less.
The answer, again, is no, because it's, of course, I mean, it depends. First level statistics will be easier to inspect, but if you really generate good the synthetic data, you are inferring from the joint initial distribution. This means that in any slice I cut the data, I should observe the same thing. That's the good thing about generative model. They infer a good initial probability distribution and they stem new sample from there. So, but I agree with you that deeper you go, then the utility might decrease. It's actually it's a topic that we're investigating up to which level we are able to maintain granular correlations and so on. But ideally, if the synthetic data are generated properly, this shouldn't happen. I mean, of course, first level will be observed easily, but then you will be also find this pattern at a deeper level, matching pattern at a deeper level. That's the goal.
Okay, so time is over. Please join me in thanking this magnificent panelist, and we'll see more on this in the near future in Rotterdam if you want to join the OS conference. Thank you very much.